Alright guys, welcome to the unit test review. Obviously we're going to be going over units 13 and chapter 13 and 14 in your books. So please feel free to follow along as we go through. I'm going to be throwing out page numbers to kind of go through and help you guys with the test for Thursday. So hopefully everybody watches this and we'll have great grades. Make sure, fan the flame, baby. Fan the flame. Get it going. Get that fuel going. Alright. So, we're going to start off with major themes of the progressive unit. Obviously, we have change, right? Change for the better overall, socially, economically, politically. We have progress in cultures, progress in people, progress within America. Conflict, we have World War I, right? We have political conflict, spoils system, assassinations, all these aspects of conflict. And lastly, precedents. Basically, precedence sets in future motion the standard that's going to be going on for future decisions. So, keeping that in mind, as we kind of go through, I'll be referring back to these things as we go along and touch on some of this information. So, have your books at the ready. I'll be having naming page numbers and stuff you can look up for information. So let's begin with reform. Now, we all know reform is change for the better, right? That was the main idea throughout the progressive era, all through the progressives. It was all about reform, all about change. We're going to change what we do politically, we're going to change what we do economically, we're going to change what we do socially, right? So what are we changing? Who should be doing the changing? In what aspects, in what ways are we doing all this change? So who should bring about the change? Enter muckrackers. What's a muckracker? Answer the question. Y'all should know this. A muckracker is basically an author who stirs up all these social issues, political issues, economic issues. So a muckracker, they write about these issues, they sell these books or pamphlets to promote change, right? So society buys these books, they educate themselves on what's going on in the world and promotes change in whatever aspect they're bringing, right? So, we're going to start with Henry George. He wrote Progress and Poverty. He challenged social Darwinism. That's a very key idea. So, social Darwinism. Right? Automatically, what should come into your head? Survival of the fittest. Darwinism refers to the social aspect of this, saying that the most fit socially are going to survive. Obviously, who has the most resources, who has the best job, who has the best resources. So those people are going to survive. We need to know that for sure. First off, Jessica, I want to apologize. I know you're already talking about how bad my handwriting is and my spelling, which is why I never write on the board anyway in class. You too, Keaton, I'm sure. Okay. So first, Mr. Henry George, right? He challenged social Darwinism. He asked the question that if American industrialists had become more wealthy, why isn't there less poverty, right? He challenged this idea of survival of the fittest, which led to the single tax. The single tax was a tax on unearned wealth. You know this really well. Inheritance on profits of land, right? Inheritances, if you have a large sum of money, like lottery gains, that's where these taxes come from, single tax, right? So next we have Mr. Lester Ward. He wrote Dynamic Society. He touched on reform Darwinism, saying that the government should fix problems before they will happen. All right, that's a very key idea. Progressivism and progress is basically referring to the overall idea that the government should have more involvement in what we do socially, economically, and politically. Right? Okay. So, Mr. Lester Ward, he touched on reform Darwinism, right? Saying the government should fix these problems before they happen, basically making it better socially, so that they shouldn't have to step in. Before these issues happen, the government should foresee and set up a society so that these issues never come about. Okay. So, naturalism. We know this idea. Okay. It's the aspect and idea that you are controlled by your situations and not your decisions. Basically saying whatever you're born to, whether it's poverty, riches, work, life, educated life, you're going to be doomed to. You're going to be destined to. You're going to be basically what your parents like, the life they built for you, right? Which leads us to our next idea, the social gospel. Okay. Now, the social gospel, all these ideas, they challenge naturalism, saying it's a movement to reform urban areas according to biblical standards. So we're going to do better for our brother, do better for the common people around us. We're going to upgrade in urban areas we're going to help children around us. Okay, children, adults, immigrants, anyone can help. Okay, this prompted the settlement house movement. It's basically provided housing for the poor, child care, medical care, provided community services, libraries, classes in English. Why do we have to have classes in English, right? We have immigrants. Immigrants were huge. They were a big part of the progressive era. Okay, all these immigrants coming from Europe, mind you, for factory jobs and opportunities. So we had to educate them, Americanize them. We know this, right? Americanize them, educate them in the American ways, teach them English, get them English books, get them reading, writing, thinking, and culturally assimilating into American cultures. Okay? So, from that, on to politics and reform. Okay? So mark this down. Hey, get a piece of paper out right now. We're going to start a timeline. Okay? Start with Mr. James A. Garfield. He was elected in 1880. Okay? Now, the significance of Mr. Garfield was that he was assassinated by Charles Guiteau in 1881, right? Guiteau, the crazy guy. Guiteau assassinated him because he didn't receive a job once he was elected, right? So what is this called? The spoil system. You know this. So the spoil system is basically any kind of government entity who receives support from anyone else, right? A commoner, a policeman, a mayor. They expect to be a part of their governmental job force, right? So it's basically, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So I gave you all the support, I gave you all this funding, I push your name out there. I would love a government job. Okay. So this led to the Pendleton Act. We need to know this. It says the government jobs can only be filled by people selected by a bipartisan civil service commission. Okay, so the Pendleton Act basically stated that government jobs could only be filled by people who were elected by this certain group. All right, so there were two sides who elected people and candidates. They would go through tests, IQ exams, literacy exams, all these things, and they would have to qualify for these type of jobs. So from that group that they selected, then, the president could elect those people and appoint them to government jobs. Okay? This leads us to the election of 1884, right? Where we have James Blaine and Grover Cleveland. Okay? So we've had a Democratic president up until, we haven't had a Democratic president up until this point, right? So the Republicans have just been knocking them out the box, presidentially speaking, for the past 20 or so years, right, up to this point. Okay. So recent corruption in the government led people to make an election of 1884, a referendum, which is basically a popular vote, okay, to make amendments and make change, right? So let's eventually to the ICC. Okay, we're going to switch gears here. Think ICC. What does that mean to us? The Interstate Commerce Commission. Okay, this was established to try to regulate trade and slow down big business. Remember, this is the kind of recurring theme progressively. Big business is bad. We have trust busting, right? We have reforming factory systems. Big business is bad, and we want to stop these places, and we want to promote competition. Okay. So the ICC, the Interstate Commerce Commission, was established to try to regulate trade and slow down big business. Okay. The court case that we have to know, is Wabash versus Illinois. Okay, basically stating that the federal government could only regulate trade. Okay, throughout the nation, states couldn't decide which rates from trade or what ceiling, that trains could move and process and run by. Okay. So this eventually led to the Sherman Antitrust Act. Okay, this was the first federal law to regulate commerce interstate. So interstate commerce, trade lead from state to state. This was the first act that led to the regulation of this. Okay, this was passed to prevent trusts. Okay, and who was the first person to use it? You all should know. We're going to get to that point. So next, we have populism, okay? Now, populism was a movement to increase the legislation for the people, right? People, populism, population, we all need to know that. So populism, the populism is the movement for the people. Okay, so it originally originated in legislation in favor of farmers. Okay, so up until this point, what did urbanization have done for the demand of food in America? It goes up, right? So urbanization, we have more people living in smaller areas, so there has to be a higher concentrate of food and products going out to feed these people. Okay, this eventually led to the Grange. You all should know that. So the Farmers Union. Okay, and eventually the People's. All this led up to the fruition of the People's Party or the Populist Party. Okay, the Populist Party wanted the government to set up sub-treasuries. Sub-treasuries, we touched on this today. Sub-treasuries are storage places countrywide to harvest crops. So what do we do when prices are too high? Okay, that means the supply is way too low. So since there's less of a product, prices go up. But if there's more of a product, prices go down. So to promote a higher product and more profit for what they were selling, they set up sub-treasuries, or places where they could store harvested goods. Okay. So, on to the Populist Party. Okay. So the Populist Party called for more government involvement. This was the idea of progressivism in itself. Progressivism meaning that they wanted more government involvement in everyday, activities and what they do, socially, economically, politically, culturally. Okay. So the Populist Party called for more government involvement. So we have sub-treasury programs, free coinage of silver, the end of protective tariffs, tighter regulation of the railroads, direct election senators. All these things were made to make better the country that we live in today, right? So we're going to shift gears here real quick, breathe. I know it's a lot of information. We can go over, you can watch the video again, and you'll be just fine, I promise. So, switch gears. We have the rise of segregation, okay? So what political party did most African Americans join? The Republicans, right? So remember up to this point, Lincoln was a Republican, okay? Abolished slavery. You have radical Republicans. Republicans are all about reform. Remember, Republicans, reform. Reform, Republicans. Republicans, reform. You should know that, okay? So let's go over the Civil War amendments, 13, 14, 15. You guys should know this like the back of your hand, okay? So, obviously, 13th freed the slaves, the 14th granted citizenship, and the 15th allowed them to vote. Correct me if I'm wrong. Feel free. Feel free to judge. It's very late night. Okay. So to stop black populations from voting, you have poll tax. Basically, charging blacks an insane amount of money to pay. And think about this time, many blacks were unemployed. Okay. So charging them to vote, you have the grandfather clause. All right, we all know this, saying if your grandfather was enslaved way back when, during the times of slavery, you couldn't vote. And they also had literacy tests. As you know, many African Americans were not educated at this point; they couldn't read. So this in itself was counterproductive. Okay. So what we have to know about the rise of segregation is Plessy versus Ferguson. Okay. Homer Plessy against Ferguson. You know this. But what we need to know significance about this is that they created a new standard with race and racial issues, calling it separate but equal. Okay? Now, this canceled the Civil Rights Act of 1875. The Civil Rights Act of 1875 basically stated that segregation, but you cannot deny someone entrance into a place or area or any type of transportation based on race. Now, Plessy versus Ferguson introduced the idea of separate but equal, separate facilities for race, but in a sense equal because they provided the same services. Now, this was totally not true. They were not equal in any way, but they were definitely separate. Okay. So this introduced the Crow laws, Jim Crow laws. Okay. So Plessy versus Ferguson introduced separate but equal, eliminating the Civil Rights Act of 1875. The Civil Rights Act again of 1875. Stated that basically segregation was illegal. So Plessy versus Ferguson introduced the Jim Crow laws. Okay. So then we have the really beginnings, the progressive idea in the beginnings. Okay, progress of civil rights with Mr. Booker T. Washington, W.E. Du Bois. What we know about these guys, this is page 383, so you can look that up. So Mr. Booker T. Washington suggests that African Americans concentrate on education and economics, right? So education and economics equal equality, in his mind for African Americans. They give them more power in the gaining of that equality. On the other hand, Mr. W.B. Du Bois stated that voting was the only way. So if you give African Americans go vote, you give them the right to vote, that equals power in his mind. Okay. So on to page 418. 418 will probably be the beginning of chapter 14 in your books. This is the beginning of the progressive movement. So what is a progressive? Someone who supports the government to take a more active role in everyday society. Okay? So that was the whole idea. So People's Party, right? Third parties, progressive. We're looking for change for the better. We want our government to come in society and go ahead and address issues before problems happen, major problems happen. That was the whole idea around this. Okay? So we're going to go on to what is a muckraker, as mentioned earlier. Okay? So they investigated social conditions, political conditions, or economic conditions, and basically wrote about them to try to prompt change. Right? So they originally coined this phrase by Mr. Roosevelt in the speech. The big bull moose, the man who spoke softly and carried a big stick. So, two important progressives we have to know. Lincoln Steffens, he wrote against political machines. We have to know that. And Mr. Jacob Riis, he wrote How the Other Half Lives. He wrote about poverty, disease, and crime in immigrant areas in New York, trying to prompt change and make life better. So, influences on the government, progressive influence on the government. How are we going to change the government? How are we going to reform the government? How are we going to help the government perform more efficiently and more better? So it all started with Mr. Robert La Follette, governor of Wisconsin. If the test mentions Wisconsin and you see Robert La Follette's name in there, put two and two together. Relate those things together, right? So he touched on the laboratory of democracy, right? He called for direct primaries. What's a direct primary, you ask? Where all party members could vote for a single candidate to run for president. Right, so this kind of did away with he's trying to push away from and do away with most the corruption. Okay, so this eventually led to the development of the 17th Amendment. The 17th Amendment, it's on page 421. Check it out. It's basically the direct election of senators by state voters. Okay, so who used to vote them in before this? It was state legislators. So for the first time in American history, the 17th Amendment introduced the idea that whoever lived in the people, the general citizens of the state, were directly elected their senators to represent them. Okay? Very important idea. So suffrage, on to suffrage, on more social progressivism, social reform, and social change. What is suffrage? You replied, women's fight to vote. Okay? So women's fighting for their rights to vote. So we have Miss Alice Paul, who organized the March on Washington in women's suffrage. Okay? Her, along with Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott at Seneca Falls. Okay. Susan B. Anthony, all important names we have to relate back to women's suffrage. Okay. So, all this basically led up to 1920 with the introduction of the 19th Amendment. Keep that in the back of your mind. The 19th Amendment, what does it do? It gives women the right to vote. 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women right to vote. Okay. Continue on with social progressivism. We have child labor. Child labor is a big deal back then. Conditions were awful. Many injuries happened on the job. There was no insurance whatsoever. Okay. So urban and rural children had always played a role in factory and farm work, right? So if you weren't educated, you weren't in schools, you were going to work in farms and factories. Okay. And then we have 1911, the fire of the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. Right? Remember, this prompted a bunch of change where buildings had to be up to code, have fire exits, backdoor exits, just from this single incident. So then we have prohibition. Prohibition, banning of the sale or consumption of alcohol. Started with the temperance movement. Okay. So from the prohibition movement, we have laws banning the manufacture and sale of alcohol. Okay. So now we're going to touch on. Pop my back. Okay, so now we're going to touch on the progressive presidents. Okay, we have Mr. Roosevelt, who was the first, right? You're going to find him on page 429. He believed in social Darwinism globally, but domestically he had the plan of the square deal, right? So the square deal. What's the deal with the square, right? So with the square, measuring stick, all sides are equal, okay? As you can see, all sides are equal from the square. So this was the idea that everyone receives equal treatment within society in America, okay? He hated trusts. We know this about Roosevelt. He was the trust buster. Have to know that, okay? He was the first president to enact the Sherman Trust Act, right? He filed a lawsuit against the Northern Securities Company, and he was the first to enact this act. That's when it happened, okay? So then we have Taft. Taft came after Roosevelt. Taft was Roosevelt's right-hand man, right? He served as Roosevelt's first lieutenant in the Army, and he was the Secretary of War. He didn't want to be president. It wasn't his thing. It wasn't really politics. But he was progressive. He carried on the ideas of Roosevelt and kind of carried the torch, got the torch passed to him in the sense of progressivism. Okay. And then lastly, we have Mr. Woodrow Wilson, who was elected in 1912, served 2 terms, right? Mr. Wilson was elected in 1912 because as a result of Roosevelt and Taft, right? Remember, Roosevelt and Taft got into it during Taft's presidency, where Roosevelt wanted to run again, right? But he couldn't get on. They couldn't share the same ticket. So Roosevelt joins what party? The Bull Moose, right? The Populist Party, Progressive Party. Okay, so he joins this third party, basically taking the votes away from the Republicans and Taft. So their votes are split, leaving all Democratic votes for Mr. Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson comes after Taft in the election of 1912, serving 2 terms. Wilson was all about progressivism. Okay, he was in favor of the Federal Reserve Act. This set interest rates. It protected small banks from collapse. He was all about the Federal Trade Commission. It monitored big business. He was all about the Child Labor Act, saying that you cannot hire children under the age of 14. He was all about reform tariffs, which lowered tariffs to make American factories improve production and lower prices. And lastly, he was about the Underwood Tariff. This levied income taxes, the 16th Amendment, right? Tax on unearned wealth. Okay? So, next, we're going to go back to social welfare in action. Mr. Upton Sinclair, what did he write? Your response is The Jungle, right? What was it about? This is on page 430. Check your books. So pop them open right now, okay? It was a book concerning the conditions of meatpacking plants all around, right? So he wrote about all the awful conditions, the rats, the mold, the dysentery, everything that was going around in these meatpacking plants, and how unsanitary it is. So from this, Roosevelt passed the Meat Inspection Act. He got a hold of this information and he realized how awful they were. So he passed the Meat Inspection Act. This is a direct effect of muckrakers, right? So that's probably your own test. Next, we have the Pure Food and Drug Act, right? It prevented the sale of unclean, unsafe, or mislabeled food and pharmaceuticals. This was a direct effect, again, of muckrakers, okay? So next, we're going to touch on the coal miners' strike of 1902. Wake up. I know this video is long. You could pause it, take a break right now. Feel free. But, back at it. So the coal miners' strike of 1902, where coal miners in Pennsylvania went on strike for months, shutting down the factories. What did this do? Coal prices go up. There was a shortage in coal, and factories had to run on this coal, right? So it was a big competition to get the rest of the coal up. Okay. So Roosevelt believed that this was an example of putting their people's own individual interests in front of Americans, which is a very bad thing. So on to World War I. Okay. So we have 2 sides here in World War I. Make sure we know this. We had the Triple Entente. Good guys. So the Triple Entente's the good guys, okay? We got Britain, France, right? 2 major players in most wars, okay? And lastly, But not least, we have Mother Russia. Right? Those are three main players: Britain, France, Russia, and eventually the United States. Next, we have the Central Powers. Bad guys. So the bad guys. Right? Central is bad. Very bad. Okay. So this was Germany, the Ottoman Empire, and Austria-Hungary. Okay. So there, the sides are set. France, Britain, Russia, the Triple Entente against Germany, Austria-Hungary, the Ottoman Empire. Okay. So this all began with the Balkan Crisis, right? The Balkan Crisis is kind of fuzzy, doesn't ring any bells. But what you know about the Balkan Crisis is it was a division between Serbia and Austria-Hungary, right? So all these people are in alliances with each other. That means if one man's in trouble, the other country's going to come to their aid, correct? Okay. So why is this significant, right? Franz Ferdinand, right? Franz Ferdinand was the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, okay? He was assassinated by a Mr. Gavrilo Princip, Brad Pitt. He was assassinated by Brad Pitt, a.k.a. Gavrilo Princip, who was a part of the Serbian terrorist organization called the Black Hand. This was the spark that started the World War. This is where it started, right here. You know, the assassination of Franz Ferdinand started in Serbia, okay? So as a direct result, Austria-Hungary decided to crush Serbia, okay? So because Germany agreed to back the Austrians, they were at war with Serbia, okay? Russia had agreed to back Serbians, so Russia is at war with Germany and Austria. And within 5 days, World War I began. It started, okay? So who did Germany immediately invade? France, okay? So they wanted to get to Belgium, which was Britain's ally. So because they got to Belgium, Britain immediately declares war on Germany. So U.S. involvement. Back to the U.S. Back to the great red, white, and blue. So which side did Woodrow Wilson take? He took the side of neutrality. He was all about staying neutral. He wanted to stay outside of both sides of the war and remain neutral. He wasn't a fan of war. Okay, but we couldn't stay out of it for long. Why, you ask? Causes of American entrance into World War I. We have the sinking of Lusitania, right? Supply ships by what? German U-boats. So German U-boats were out sinking all these ships they find in the types of oceans, trying to crush, right, supply lines and trade lines between the major countries, the major fighters, right? So there were U.S. passengers on the Lusitania that were sank. So blood was shed in the water, right? So because of this, Germany didn't want America to join in the war, right? America threatened to join the war. They said, "Hey, you can't be sinking our ships. You can't be killing our people. We're fixing to jump in." So Germany backs off. They say, "Hey, we'll sign the Sussex Pledge." The Sussex Pledge, saying that U-boats will no longer sink passenger ships or supply ships, in the waters they find. Okay, this didn't last long. The Germans kept sinking ships. In fact, they say 6 more. Okay. Now, the final straw that broke the back of the Americans' neutral stance was the Zimmermann telegram, right? So a telegram from Germany to Mexico encouraging an alliance between the two nations, where Mexico would basically be encouraged to start a war with America and invade, causing them to focus more domestically on issues. Okay, so the Zimmermann telegram, the Sussex Pledge, sinking the Lusitania. That's what we need to know about America's entrance in the war. Okay? So on to the next point. You will find that on page 454. Open your books, take a glance at it. It'll be worth it. So, fastest way to build a military, you got a draft. This was the first installation of the draft. You were eligible to draft if you were over the age of 18, or 21 to 30, scratch that. 21 to 30, you would register for draft, right? So, because these people were gone, there were a lot of what left in America? Jobs, right? So who filled those jobs? Blacks, Mexicans, women, right? Children even, okay? So this opened up opportunities for many of the minority races. We have to know that. Okay. This also enacted many cutbacks domestically within America. We have rationing, right? You got to buy less. You got to consume less. We're sending a lot of supplies off to the war, so we're encouraging Americans to cut back and settle for less to help the workers. Okay. So, obviously, we have combat. All right, all new types of new technology: bolt-action rifles, U-boats, poison gas, gas masks, helicopters, airplanes, penicillin, so pillboxes, high explosive shells, rapid-fire machine guns, bolt-action rifles. Okay. So, all these new technologies is the first time in American era in world history that all these new technology was used. Okay. We have to know the Battle of Argonne Forest. Okay, this was the most massive one of the most up to in history, all over, the most massive American attack. Okay, over 600,000 soldiers for one battle. Imagine that. Okay. So as a result of the Battle of Argonne Forest, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire surrendered. Berlin rebelled and forced a German emperor to step down, and on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, the fighting stopped, and armistice was signed. An armistice meaning a ceasefire. Okay. So the end of the war, you have the Treaty of Versailles with the Big Four: President Wilson, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, George Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando from Italy. Okay. So the Treaty of Versailles. What we need to know is Wilson had 14 points. He suggested free trade, disarmament, freedom of the seas, impartial adjustment of colonial claims, and open diplomacy. The next 8 called for an evacuation and of invaded countries, right, and invaded territories. And then lastly, he called for a League of Nations. We ended up joining the League of Nations. That becomes an issue later. Okay. So he brought the idea of the League of Nations back to senators. Senators would not vote for it. They wanted a way out of the League of Nations. This basically kind of sparked. They didn't want alliances. They wanted to remain neutral. They didn't want alliances with other countries and try to avoid another global conflict. We'll see how that lasts 20 years later. Right. But the main thing about the Treaty of Versailles is that Germany's hit hard, so hard. They have to pay major war reparations, leading up to about $33 billion. Put Germany in Great Depression and basically set the stage for World War II. Okay. So, the impacts of war. It leads to many strikes, right? Jobs are at a very high price now. Soldiers are coming back. They want their jobs back. They want their lives back. So this led to many strikes, right? We have the coal miners strike, the Seattle General strike, the Boston police strike, the steel strike, right? So all these people just refusing to work. So production goes down, stopping the country and halting at its heart, where it is industry. Okay. So we have racial unrest and the Red Scare. Okay. So people are coming back, wanting their jobs back. Who has the jobs? Minorities, immigrants, blacks, whites, white women, all types of women, and children. So this led to racial unrest. Eventually, the Red Scare, which is basically anti-German sentiments and anti-communistic ideas. Okay. Now, communism. What was the big deal about that, you ask? Russia left the war, right? 1919, they just leave the war, right in the middle of it. Why? Because the Bolshevik revolution. People are hungry. They rebelled against the government, okay? So they left it. The government gets overthrown. Communism is introduced, okay? And this new idea of communism is introduced to the world. Right? So this led to the Red Scare, where basically anything bad that happened domestically in America was blamed on communists. Okay. So, from that we had Mr. J. Edgar Hoover led to lead the GID, the General Intelligence Division, which later becomes the FBI, right? This all spawned out of anti-communist sentiments and domestic terrorism attacks. Okay. So that about does it. We're going to review again tomorrow in class. You guys, please watch this video. I gave you page numbers in the book. Look over your notes. They're highlighted. Take an hour today. Look over the notes and the materials. And I know you're going to grade on your test. Appreciate you watching all 35 minutes of the video. Thank you, guys.